thinking about investing in your very first ETF, or maybe you have been investing in ETFs for years, in this video I am going to cover the pros and cons of investing in ETFs. Hello, my name is Rachel and welcome back to the channel. So we're going to start with talking through the advantages or pros of investing in exchange traded funds or ETFs. But if you're feeling negative and you'd rather skip through to the cons, then I'll put timestamps in the bottom so you can skip through to those. So starting with the very first pro of investing in ETFs, and that is diversification. So if you very quickly want to build a diverse portfolio, then you could invest in something like a FTSE All World ETF. So you are getting exposure to stocks across the whole world and you are getting a very diverse portfolio. You can also have a diverse US stocks portfolio by investing in, say for example, the S&P 500, which invests in the top 500 companies in the US. So you're making one single simple investment and you are getting exposure to many different diverse stocks. So that is our first pro, diversification. Okay, so moving on to our next pro, and that is transparency. So when you are investing in an ETF, you can actually see each and every individual stock which forms part of that ETF. So instead of just being able to see the top 10 holdings, you can see each and every investment within a specific ETF. Now you can actually see all 3,479 different stocks that form part of a FTSE All World ETF. So let's look at Vanguard's VWRL, which is Vanguard's low-cost FTSE All World ETF. As I said, there's 3,479 different stocks, and you're not just getting an understanding of the top 3 stocks, which are Microsoft, Apple, and Nvidia. You can also take a deep dive and have a look at every single stock that forms part of this ETF. So let's have a little deep dive into this ETF and have a look at some of the more mainstream companies that you might have heard of that form part of this FTSE All World ETF. So you can see here that Tesla makes up 0.8% of this ETF, Walt Disney is making up 0.3%, American Express makes up 0.2%, and Nintendo is making up 0.1%. Now there are many platforms that will show you all of the different holdings within a specific ETF. So moving on to our third and potentially most important pro of investing in ETFs, and that is the low fees. Now with investing, you do not have a crystal ball and you cannot see into the future, so you can't control how well your investments are going to do. However, what you can control is the fees that you are paying for those investments, and that will have a massive impact on the amount of money that you are left with at the end of your investment journey. Now I personally believe that choosing low cost ETF investments is a really wise thing to do, and you can have a look at different ETFs and see that actually some of them are comparable and some of them have much cheaper fees than others. So really do take a look at fees when you're choosing which ETF to invest in. A couple of examples of some low cost ETFs that I personally have investments in are Invesco's FTSE All World, which code for that is FWRG, and the fees for that are just 0.15%, and Vanguard's S&P 500 ETF, which is VUSA, have fees of just 0.07%. But when you've decided which ETF you want to invest in, please do look at the different providers for these ETFs. So look at Invesco, look at Vanguard, look at iShares, and see who has the cheapest offering, because it's so important to really keep those fees down low. And the fourth and final pro that I want to include in this video is the flexibility of investing in ETFs. Now ETFs trade like stocks, so you can buy them through the course of the day when the market is open, so you can buy them at different prices throughout the day. So you can also sell them throughout the trading day as well, so they are very flexible investments. Okay, so moving on now to cons or disadvantages of investing in ETFs. I would like to preface this by saying that 70% of my investment portfolio is made up of ETFs. So I personally see a lot of the advantages of investing in ETFs outweighing the negatives, but it is really important to understand the cons of investing in ETFs before you choose to invest in them. So the first con that I wanted to cover is volatility and risk. Just because you are investing in an ETF doesn't mean that you cannot lose your money. You are still making an investment, and that investment can still be very volatile. Now there are some ETFs that can be even more volatile than others. So for example, you can invest in ETFs that cover a specific sector. So when you are buying an investment that covers a specific sector rather than, say for example, a region, an example I want to point out to you is the iShares Global Clean Energy ETF. Now the code for that is INRG. This has been an incredibly volatile ETF. So from March 23 to March 24, this ETF lost just over 30% of its value. So just because this is an ETF doesn't mean that it's not volatile, and it certainly doesn't mean that you can't lose your money. So a good way to get an understanding of risk and volatility when investing in ETFs is to simply have a look at their standard deviation. So the higher an ETF standard deviation, the more volatile and risky it is, and arguably the lower the standard deviation, the better. So with the INRG ETF, which is the Global Clean Energy ETF, the 3-year standard deviation for that ETF is 25.78. So that is quite a high number, and it is a more volatile ETF. And to counter that, if you have a look at a more diverse ETF, for example, Vanguard's FTSE All World ETF, the 3-year standard deviation for that ETF is 10.29. So you've got a much lower standard deviation, so potentially a lower risk level and potentially less volatility with that ETF. So what I'm really trying to point out here is that often ETFs are shown to be much lower risk and easier investments to make, but I really want to show you that actually there is always some risk involved with investing, and it's always a really good idea to have a look in close detail at the ETFs you are investing in, rather than thinking simply because it's an ETF it's a good investment, because that is not always the case. Okay, so the second con of investing in ETFs is that you do not have control over the individual stocks and individual companies within that ETF. So as I said, when you invest in a single ETF, you are getting a whole basket of different stocks within that ETF. So if there is a specific company that you are not a fan of and you wouldn't want to invest in, then it's important to check that it doesn't form part of that ETF. You also might have some very strong beliefs or specific reasons as to why you wouldn't want to invest in certain ETFs. Now, there are some ways around that. For example, there are ETFs that are screened for ESG or environmental, social and governance, or have SRI screenings for socially responsible investing, or there are some ETFs that are screened to comply with certain religious investment principles. But as I said earlier, there's a great deal of transparency around different ETFs, and you should be able to get a list of all of the different investments that fall into a single ETF, and therefore hopefully not be investing in companies that you do not want to be investing in. Now, the third and final con for this video is that investing in ETFs can be seen as boring. Now, this might be controversial to many of you, and as I said, over 70% of my portfolio is in ETFs, so I am a boring investor. So the reason I choose to invest in ETFs is because they are simple, low-cost investments that get me a nice, diverse portfolio. However, it is certainly not as exciting investing in ETFs as it is building your own individual stocks and shares portfolio. I find researching individual stocks and shares very interesting, and it's a really good talking point when one of them does very, very well. It's great to say this has done very, very well. You might hear more of the stories about stocks that have done well than the stocks that have not done as well from people. But just to say that investing in ETFs can be a little bit boring. However, when it comes to investing, I believe that there is nothing wrong with making boring investments. And time again, we've actually seen that ETFs do tend to outperform actively managed funds. And those are actively managed funds that are managed by absolute professional investors. So even though investing in individual stocks and shares can be more interesting than investing in ETFs, I still personally believe that having a portfolio that is predominantly made up of ETFs is the right decision for me, albeit a little bit boring. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch, and I hope you have a lovely day. Bye bye.